Well, I'm Max King, and I'm a real oddity. I'm a native of Florida, and around here you don't see many Floridians, people that were born and raised here. And I love to ask that question when I go to a meeting hall, how many of you from Florida? And you may get 2 or 3 hands raised, but most of them come from out of state. But I take great delight in telling people about my early childhood. Grew up in Fort Pierce, one of 8 children. My father was a barber. My mother had not finished high school, but she was a great lady and really did a good job of raising 8 children. After my father died in early life, he was only 35 when he died. Back then, tuberculosis was a big thing, and he died early and left 8 kids at home, and my mother and the kids we raised ourselves. So it was interesting because of the 8 kids, and there are only 3 of them left now. Time passes, but 3 of us are left. The brothers did well. Our oldest brother, Buddy, or Hiram was his name. He was named after my father, who was Hiram King. But he was always called Buddy, and he was the one that worked in the CCCs and went in the Army Air Force and served during the World War II in the Air Force. And then the next brother was Lawrence, Larry, we called him, and he finished high school and went in the Marines and was served in Iwo Jima and Tarawa throughout the South Pacific. But the most unusual World War II story was my brother Edward, who was just a year or 2 years older than I, and he went in the Navy in World War II, and within 7 weeks from the time he went in, he was coxswain on a landing craft that were landing troops at Normandy Beach, at Omaha Beach. And that always had a traumatic impact on his life. But those 3 older brothers served in World War II. I happened to take an ROTC at college and came back, and after ROTC, the Korean War was in progress, so I got called to active duty and spent 3 years primarily in Texas during the Korean conflict, and learned a lot about military life and from there. My oldest sister, Louise, was a great provider of income. She started out as a waitress, and then she ended up working for the recreation department in the city of Miami, and for ages worked in the Hialeah recreation department. And then the 2 younger sisters, Jacqueline and Gwendolyn, were twins, and they ended up working as waitresses and waiters and earning the money, just as my younger brother Charlie was the one that probably had to work the least, but he did real well. He followed in our footsteps. And incidentally, about Charlie, he followed in my footsteps and became a college president in Virginia for 40 years. He was a college president in Virginia. He's retired now, living in Fort Pierce and in parts of Virginia.
Tell us about, 8 of you in the house. When your mother was by herself, what was that like?
Well, it was tough, and we had what you'd call pallets. We'd sleep on the floor, but put a blanket on the floor and sleep on the floor. And we had many relatives that would come in from Okeechobee, who would, at that time of their lives, were not well financially either, and they'd spend the time with us. My mother, for some reason, was always able to keep food on the table and to keep the kids working, and all of us worked from the very beginning. I shined shoes when I was very young, and I also ended up working on a dredge boat for one summer, working on a widening US 1 from north of Fort Pierce, pulling the levers to put asphalt and rock all together to make the roads safe. But everybody worked. And even though there was welfare at the time, for some reason, I think based on my mother, she didn't believe in welfare. She thought we ought to take care of ourselves, and we did. We worked, supplied money to the family, and did not have to go into the welfare lines to get the foods and food stamps and so forth that many people, many of our friends and neighbors did, but for some reason my mother didn't believe in that, and she kind of taught that to her children.
Tell us some of the earliest memories you have that really stand out in your mind.
Well, one stands out with my father. He was sick. We didn't understand the sickness, but he was we had a 3-bedroom house, and he was in the back bedroom. And in late afternoon after school, we'd always get out in our backyard and play football. And I remember my dad tapping on the window and motioning me to come here, and he said, "Max," he said, you're going to be a great football player. You're doing a great job. And later on in school, I played football and scored the most points of any high school in the country at one point in time, and then went to school on a football scholarship. So I think that little bit of advice or encouragement helped me to continue to do something with my life through athletics. And I went to Auburn on a football scholarship and did real well. I like to tell about I have a national average, yard per carry. I carried the ball one time against the University of Georgia and ran the ball 65 yards and got tackled and broke my shoulder. So I wasn't able to play anymore after that. And then the following spring I was doing real well, and then tore my knee up and they had to do surgery on my knee. But for some reason, the coaches liked me and they kept me on full scholarship for the full 4 years. So I got 4 years of education out of that football experience.
Who are the most sort of influential people do you think in your early life that really influenced you?
Well, a fellow that was my high school football coach, his name was Ben Bryan. He later became principal of the high school and superintendent of schools. And he followed me when I went into Auburn. He followed me, and when I graduated from Auburn, I had a job in Fort Pierce teaching and coaching, and then got called to active duty in the military. And he kept me on leave from the time I was in military, and also the time I came back and went to the University of Florida and got my master's and doctor's degree. He was able to keep me on official leave, and then after I got my doctorate, I came back and became principal of the same high school where I'd graduated. And I think all this I attributed to Ben Bryan, because he took care of me and helped me along the way, and I'll never forget all the many things he did to help me. And then when we started the first college, he helped select me as the first college president in St. Lucie County, president of what was then Indian River Junior College, later Indian River Community College, and now Indian River State College. But Ben Bryan, I think, was responsible for me having a lot of success in that area.
When did you first sort of understand you wanted to be involved in education?
Well, it was primarily through my football days, and then wanting to go into coaching. And I knew you had to be a teacher to also be a coach, so that's what started it. And it's interesting enough, when I first went in the military, I was a young second lieutenant. And at Fort Hood, Texas, I was the coach of the Fort Hood Tankers football team for 1 4-month period. And we had many All-Americans that were in the military at the time, and I had took great pride in coaching those fellows in football. And then later on, I went in to become a tank company commander, and went on the military route after that.
Who were your best friends in your teenage years?
I had a family. They had a family. They are a German family whose last name was Scharfswert, Scharfschwerdt. And Bill was the same age as I was, and he and I played football together. He went to Georgia Tech on a football scholarship, and I went to Auburn on a football scholarship. And I always used to love to go over to Atlanta where Bill was, and we'd go to the Varsity Grill, which is a number of varsity grills in the Atlanta area. And that always left a good impression on me about Atlanta, Georgia, and the Georgia Tech football team. But even though we were competitors, we were good friends and stayed friends. He died at an early age, but all of his family was always great. Mr. and Mrs. Scharfswert, his brothers and sisters were always helpful to me. In fact, I worked on their citrus grove a couple of summers when I was in high school, learned how to do everything from pick oranges to trim the trees in the citrus groves. But I also learned some things I didn't want to do. That was picking tomatoes and picking strawberries. There's nothing worse than picking tomatoes out in the hot sun. I knew there was something better for me in life than that. And that's why athletics kind of gave me the way into the door. And then when later on things started, I started as community college president, and some other stories I could tell you about that, but I'll let you ask me some more questions.
Sure. Tell us, let's digress a little bit, but tell us about your mother.
Ida Mae Chandler King. She was a Chandler, and she grew up in Fort Bassinger, which is just north of Okeechobee, and on a cattle ranch. And her father was somewhat well-to-do on the cattle ranch, but she, at the time she finished 8th grade when she met my father, and they got married at an early age, and then he moved to Fort Pierce. They had 8 children, immediately came along the way, and then my father died. My younger brother Charlie was only 2 years old. And incidentally, that's another story. We lived on 15th Street in Fort Pierce, and right across the canal was where the blacks lived, and on one side, on the south side, the whites lived. But we were real good friends of a black minister named Jim and Emma Jones. And we were always over visiting there and so forth. And we were at the Joneses when my father died, and my older sister came and told Mr. Jones, and he got us all together and had some sad news to tell us that father had just passed away. But one thing he wanted all of you to do, and you remember this, kids, and I'll never forget Reverend Jones saying this, he wanted you all to get an education and do something with your lives. And that always made an impression on me. When we went to the funeral, the caravan going to Okeechobee, I rode with the Jones family to Okeechobee for the gravesite, and we occasionally go back over to where my father's buried in Okeechobee.
How old were you when your father passed away?
I was 7.
Mm-hmm. And how do you remember feeling when you first heard that news?
Well, it's hard to. It's interesting in a way. It's even though it had to be sadness, but there was also all the people getting together for the funeral was interesting. And I must tell you a story about my father, whose mother was a Cherokee Indian out of North Carolina. So he was partial Indian, and I guess I've got a lot of Indian blood in me, but I'll never forget my grandmother. Her name was Katie McKee. And she came to visit me one time, visit us on 15th Street in Fort Pierce. And I looked out the door. I was about 5 years old, I guess. And I saw this Model T Ford coming down the street with 4 Indian ladies with a full Indian regalia on. And I ran and hid under my mother's bed because it bothered me. And then my grandmother came in and whispered to me, Max, get out from under the bed. Your grandmother wants to see you. But I'll always remember what a foolish thing that was to go hide from my grandmother, who I had not seen very many times in life. But she was Indian, and I take great pride in mentioning I wear a ring, which I say is part of my Cherokee background, but this ring came from Louisiana. But another funny story about the Indians, when I went to South America and Suriname, I was consulting with some groups down there, and I met the Amur Indian tribe down in Suriname. And they made me an honorary chief of the Amur Indians in the Suriname Amazon Valley, and that was always a big honor for me to remember my grandmother and my Indian background, and the Cherokees in North Carolina, and the Kings in Fort Pierce.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating stuff. So tell us do you have memories of your father himself?
Just vaguely. I remember the talk about him when I overhear him talk about tuberculosis. And at that time, they were trying to save money to send him to Colorado, Arizona, because they thought the climate there would be good for somebody with tuberculosis.
So this would have been about what year?
That would have been 1934, because he died in 35. And but we never weren't able to save enough money to send him out to Arizona. But I don't know where that myth is true or not, but I can remember other people going to different parts of the country when they had diseases.
Interesting. So your dad was about how old when he passed away?
He was 35 years of age, yeah.
Okay, and his profession?
He was a barber.
Okay.
It's interesting. He had a barber shop down on 2nd Street in Fort Pierce, and but on Sundays afternoon, he'd open up on the front porch of our house on 15th Street and cut any boy that came in, get a free haircut. He'd cut their hair. And that was always fun to have all those neighbor kids come in and get a free haircut.
Mm-hmm. Now, talking about the Depression, you know, what kind of things would should people sort of understand about what that was like back then versus life today?
Well, it was interesting. I'll never forget, there were a lot of what we call hobos at the time. People who were just wandering through Florida, and they wandered through one town and another. And my mother always had a sign out, if you're a hobo, go to the back door, and she would give them food when they come to the back door, but she wouldn't give them food through the front door for some reason. I don't know, that was the way things were done in those days, but there were a lot of people that would stop off the street to ask for a handout of food. And there was a lot of poverty going on in those days.
Was that pretty common with other families to help people like that?
Yes, I think it was in our area. The people across the street from me, the Carlisles and the Kendalls, were always helping people, and this, I don't know why, but the hobos, the people that were, you see them around town these days, but they walk down and pick a house and knock on the door and pick the right one. They'd send them to the back door and feed them food.
Did you ever get up into any mischief when you were a young person?
Oh yeah, I was, not really bad mischief, but I'll tell you a funny story about that. I was pretty fast running, and the career boys were dubbed around the corner, and we were always getting together, going down, and at Halloween we would soap windows. You get some octagon soap and go and soap windows, and people didn't like that. But one day, we went over to 13th Street. There was about 5 boys, and we were soaping windows, and then we saw a paper bag about 100 yards ahead of us in a street, and the rule then, you saw a paper bag, everybody started running. Whoever could kick the bag first was the winner. And I ran like mad, and I got there and I kicked that bag, and bang, broke a couple of toes. The neighbors knew we were coming, and they put a brick in the bag. So, but there goes a barefooted boy without any shoes on.
You graduated from the high school here in Okeechobee?
No, we graduated from Fort Pierce High School. 12 years in the same school, 1st grade to the 12th, and that school is still on Delaware Avenue in Fort Pierce. It's a beautiful school building. And I'll never forget, when I was in 1st grade, there was a play that the teacher put on called Hansel and Gretel. And I wasn't much of an actor, but I played one small part in that story of Hansel and Gretel. And that was on the auditorium, and that was the same auditorium when I graduated from high school. I went across the stage and got my diploma. And the school still exists. It's a special school of some type, I'm not sure what now. But it's a beautiful building, and we're trying to, involved in keeping that renovated so it'll be a long-time archive for that community.
And then leaving Fort Pierce High School and going on to Auburn. You were there for 4 years?
4 years at Auburn. They treated me well there, and for some reason they liked me, and they even though I got hurt and couldn't play anymore, and but they kept me on scholarship, which was most unusual in those days. Usually if somebody got hurt, they'd run them off so they could give the scholarship to somebody else. but they kept me on, and I always appreciate the effort. I go back, I've been honored, Auburn has honored me a couple of times since then, and I've taken great pride in going back and telling them what it meant to me to have that 4 years of education.
Who are the most outstanding people you remember from your college days?
Well, Travis Tidwell was an outstanding quarterback, and Erskine Russell, who later graduated with me and became coach at Georgia Southern for about 40 years. He turned out some great football teams there. And there were, time passes and you forget names, but Chester Klein was another one that came down and after he graduated from Auburn. Later on, I hired him to teach in school in Fort Pierce when I was principal of the high school there.
Mm-hmm. And as far as the people outside of athletics in college, anyone else that comes to mind, a particular interest and note?
Well, I remember when I was in high school, and later on when I was principal of that high school, there was the fellow that headed up the band was named Major O'Neill, and he had a great band. He was always helping kids along the way with the band. And it's interesting because the building, when I was there as a student, where the band was, when we started the first college there, Indian River College, I used that same building as the administrative offices for the college when I opened the college in 1960 there. But Major O'Neill was always a great standout, and his replacement was a classmate of mine, a year or two older than I, Harold Supank, who did the same thing that Major O'Neill did.
Tell us about when you graduated from Auburn, that period of time when you started to want to get an education. Tell us how that evolved.
Well, I studied to be a teacher, and Ben Bryan, I told you, hired me to be a teacher. And that's an interesting story because I was 1 year teaching there and coaching, and I got called to active duty. And the students, for some reason, liked me, and they heard that I'd been called to active duty during the Korean War. So they went down to the local sheriff, Johnny Norville, I knew real well, and they said, "The Sheriff Norville, we'd like for Mr. King not to have to go in the military. Would you come out and arrest him so he won't have to go?" So Johnny came to my door and knocked on the door, and I came to the door, and he says, "Max, I'm sorry, but I'm here to arrest you." I said, "What for?" He said, "So you won't have to go in the military." I went in anyhow for my 3 years in the military. So, but that was a funny story, and I've gone back to some reunions down there and saw some of those kids that did that, and they were all, for some reason, they said, "We really liked you."
So you went for 3 years into the military. Tell us about that experience.
Well, that was a good experience. That's where I ended up meeting my wife. She was a blind date for another at the officers club, and she lured me away from the date I had, and I ended up marrying her, and she and I have been married for 63 years now. I told her she was a Texas war bride.
Tell us about the first time you met her.
Well, we were at an officers club dancing, and the young officers always switched around, and so it came time for me to dance with her, and we just, I spent a lot of time talking to her about my family, and she said that impressed her, somebody was so family oriented. So later on, we kept seeing each other and finally decided to get married. And it was well done. We have 5 children, and she still goes back out to Texas every now and then for her family reunion, but Florida's her home now. She's spent more time in Florida than she has in Texas.
Tell us about Doris, a little bit about Doris's family.
Well, her father was an engineer, worked for the county government engineer, and built a number of dams out in West Texas for little rivers that flow through there. And then she had a couple of brothers that were medical doctors, had gone to University of Texas and other places. And she went to Mary Hardin Baylor, which was primarily at that time a girls' school in Texas, and then got her baccalaureate degree from that school. But she had a good family, and of her family, there were 10 children in her family, and only 2 are left. And where there were 8 children in my family, and there are 3 of us left: my brother Charlie and I, and my sister Gwen.
What was it like when you first got married? Did you immediately get a home
Immediately did. Well, came back immediately. Got out of service and came back to Fort Pierce for a short time, and then up to Gainesville. We stayed in Flavet Village for 3 years up there. And
what brought you to Gainesville?
University of Florida. My younger brother had gone to school there on a football scholarship while I was in the military, and so I went there. And then some of my college classmates, a couple of them from Auburn, went to the University of Florida. And I will never forget, we had professors, Dr. Lyles, several others whose names slip me right now, but they liked me and kept me on. The idea was just to get my master's degree, and they encouraged me to stay on and get my doctor's degree after I got my master's degree.
Okay, so you were there for how long?
3 years.
Okay, so in that time you got your master's and your doctorate.
Right.
In education.
Right.
Okay.
Kimball Wiles was one of the professors I was telling you about. He wrote a book and did real well. Or R.L. Johns was another one of my major professor. But it was interesting. They treated me well. In fact, I think that's part of the story of success of my life. Everywhere I've been treated well by other people, and I try to do the same for others and help people along the way.
So when you were at Gainesville there, how were you financing your
Well, that was great because I had the GI Bill and also had a fellowship at the university. It was amazing. We were able to, and Doris worked in one of the labs at the hospital there. She was a medical technician. So we just, I didn't have to work because I was getting those GI Bill and the fellowship, and finished that dissertation in a hurry and went back to my hometown and became principal of the high school, and then the president of the first college down there.
How did you first become president? How did you get that going there?
Through Ben L. Bryan. He's the superintendent of schools. He was still superintendent, and whenever they started looking for one, of course, Jim Wattenbarger, who was later was a professor at the University of Florida, but he had gone to the University of Florida and written a doctoral dissertation on set up a 2-year college system in Florida, and the state passed the legislation that allowed those, in essence, that dissertation to become the plan for the 28 junior colleges in Florida. And Jim later became chancellor of the system in Florida. But it was his doctoral dissertation that set the system up in Florida.
So you were sort of right place, right time in a way.
Yeah, well, right people.
Right people, yeah. So you got that going at Indian River Community College. And how many students were there initially?
Well, we started out, there were 65 in the first class. And I'll never forget the first student that we recruited was a young lady named Ann Callie, and she was the first graduate. And later on, she became a professor up in the New England area. I forget the name of the college, but she did real well with her life. But when we have reunions, she always comes back and takes pride in her being the first student that graduated from Indian River.
The funding to get that college going, and did you have any particular friends up at Tallahassee at that time to get things started? That's
an interesting story, yes. Harry Kicklighter was a state senator. And when it came time in 1958, it was time for Indian River to start a 2-year college. But part of that, the county school board had to come up with $18,500, and they couldn't find that kind of money. So I went to see Senator Kicklighter, and he was able to get the money from the dog track fund to put in there to match what the state required, so for us to get started in 1960. But Harry Kicklighter, the state senator, did that. Much the same as Clark Maxwell. who was a state senator here when I came up here, and we wanted to get money to build this performing arts center here. And Clark was able to go to the legislature and get the $9 million at the time to build this particular building here, which later became the Performing Arts Center.
So there was a tie-in there. That's interesting, yeah. So after, about how many years were you at Indian River?
8 years.
Okay.
And at the time, there was an unwritten rule in the country that you only stayed 6 to 8 years in top leadership position. And then you moved on and gave somebody else a chance. So that unwritten rule I followed when they came down from Brevard and recruited me to come up there. But that rule passed out the door because I stayed at Brevard for 30 years and we no longer listened to that.
Yeah, this unwritten rule you're talking about, you're talking about across educational institutions?
In educational, you'd have a national meeting, they'd talk about 6 to 8 years and then you moved on and gave somebody else a chance.
Yeah. Tell us about how you were recruited to come to Brevard.
Well, a fellow named Rodney Ketchum, who was on the board at the time, came down and told me they wanted me to come up in the Space Center and take over for I had known the first president of the college here, J. Bruce Wilson, real well. He was a great friend of mine. In fact, we were at the University of Florida together. And but Bruce left and went to Jacksonville, started another college there after 5 years here. And so I decided that being up here near the Space Center would be a good thing to do, and I was able to do it, and I enjoyed it very much. They treated me well here, and I'm not sorry of the move, but I still had close ties to the people back in Fort Pierce, which was my hometown.
So Rodney Ketchum was on the board of BCC?
Right, yeah.
And about what year was that when he first contacted you?
It would have been 1967, because I came here in 68.
Okay. And how did Doris feel about the move?
Oh, we liked it down there, but she liked it better than the kids did, because some of the kids were still in school then, and moving from Fort Pierce to another school was tough for them, but they survived it very well. And of my 5 children, they all did well with their education and got good jobs. And
what do you remember about Brevard County in '67?
well, it was always space related. That was everything was tied in with the space program. Palm Bay hadn't got started yet. Palm Bay as a city didn't come till later on after General Development developed Port St. Lucie. They came up and developed Palm Bay.
And so the actual, with the 4 campuses, were the BCC campuses?
That was the dream. It was, just like in, and we set those up before I left. In St. Lucie, the dream was 4 campuses, also 1 in each of the 4 county area. But Brevard only had 1 county, but it was a long, narrow county, and the idea was Titusville, Cocoa, Melbourne, and Palm Bay, and that all came to pass.
Mm-hmm. How long of a period did that actually take to create the 4 campuses, and who were the key players involved in that? Well,
the Board of Trustees, again, there were a lot of, and also the state, Clark Maxwell Jr., who was in the state senate, later became chancellor of the community college system. But he, all I had to do was talk to him and tell him about Palm Bay was growing, we needed a campus there. Melbourne was already growing, we needed a campus there. In Titusville, and it would just fit into the system of the state plan.
Okay, and some of the other key people that you remember that were leaders, along with you, developing this incredible, college system we have here now. Who would they be over the years?
Well, again, Clark Maxwell Jr. as a head of the chancellor of the system. Bruce Wilson, who was the first president, later went to Jacksonville and started Jacksonville College. Ed Easy, who was at Palm Beach, started the college there and did a lot to add to the growth. But there are other names, and many of the names I forget right now. I have to go back and look at my book. But they all did a good job of developing it. And that's one thing I believe strongly in. you remember the history and the legacy of people that have gone on before you. And anytime you have a meeting, it encompasses a lot of background. Talk about some of the things those people did. And as time goes by, the whole movement, people will understand how it moved from this end to where it is today. And now, all of the 28 community colleges are now state colleges, four-year colleges. And that's great, because as long as they don't forget the original mission and the legacy that was built in the early days.
What about people in Brevard County that you can really say, were very helpful in you achieving all what you've achieved here in the county? Who would they be?
Well, most of them end up being either in government or in the legislature, in local government or legislature, county commissions, school board members, people that just made their impact on the area. And when I talk about education, you need to talk about the whole group of people that were helpful to the development of the K-12 system as well as the community college. FIT, and I can remember very, very close to Jerry Cooper, who was president of FIT, and what he's done there. And the president there has followed in his footsteps and done a great job. Florida Tech is a great university now and doing well. At what's now the University of Central Florida, it started out as Florida Technological University in Orlando, but later changed the name. Charlie Milliken was the first president. I was very close to Charlie, and we ended up starting the first off-campus program for the University of Central Florida on our Cocoa campus here. And in fact, there's a building there named after the University of Central Florida. Charlie Milliken, and then the president that came, one just passed away that followed Milliken, and then John Hitt has been the president there for 16, 18, 20 years. He's done a great job, built their school into the second or third largest university in the country, is there at the University of Central Florida.
Who are your best friends here in the county?
Well, I've a lot of golfing friends. Fred Gay, who's passed away, and I were longtime friends. He had a quality Pontiac dealership. Rodney Ketchum was Jim Hooper, who's deceased also. He had an automobile dealership there. Jim Hanley, who's been active in politics around the area for ages, is just a great human being and does a lot to the community. He works with the Crosswinds Youth Program, and there's just a lot of people that have given a lot of their time and effort to improving things for the people that will follow in our footsteps.
Do you have anything that going forward? You're still a young man. What are your any particular goals, ambitions for the
Well,
future?
I'm just still active in the community and working with a lot of different groups: Boys and Girls Club, Children's Advocacy, Salvation Army, the BCC Foundation, helping them raise money. The theaters in the area, the Village Theater, the King Center, the Sunrise Theater in Fort Pierce. For somebody that I wasn't a young actor, but I had a great pride in helping develop the performing arts facilities. You may have heard the story about the Village Theater, but I purchased it for $1 from the city of Cocoa. And then we restored it, and they do a great job. Stacy Hawkins Smith is the director of that, and she puts on great local performances. Guys and Dolls are coming up this weekend, I think. If you haven't seen it, you really ought to go see it. It's a great show.
People look at your career and they see everything you've done, and they sort of scratch their head. They don't understand, how you were able to get all these things done. If you had to sort of summarize how you've been able to, get all these things done in your career, how would you describe that process?
if something needs to be done, you get out and try to do it. I'll say two things. The Village Theater, the performing arts in the area. There was a lot of talk in the community when I first came here about wanting a performing arts center similar to what they had in Orlando and West Palm Beach. And everywhere I'd go to speak, the ladies' clubs or the Rotary or so forth, people would say, why don't we have a performing arts center in the area? And I heard it so much, I said, well, I need to go to the county and the school board and college board. And to make a long story short, they finally told me, if you want to have one, you get out and do it. So that's when I went to Clark Maxwell and got the money for this, build this building. The Village Theater, taking, buying that and then restoring it with the help of a lot of volunteer help. They've just done a great job. And the Sunrise Theater in Fort Pierce, which is a place where I, as a young kid, I'd worked there, taking up tickets, selling tickets. And the building just went derelict, and I started going down there, and that was after I'd retired here at Brevard, and I'd go down 4 or 5 days a week to help raise money to restore the Sunrise Theater. And it seats 1,200 people, and they bring in a lot of the same shows that Steve Janicki brings here to see the shows. It was just something to do, and it all comes back from the thought that was put in my mind, if something needs to be done, get out and do it. And the only way to do something is to do it. The only way to lead is to lead. You get out and you try to get other people to get involved, and then you move on and do it. One final thought on those lines. I'll never forget, I was a young college president traveling in Europe with 9 other university presidents. I was the only junior college president in the group. And we went to a number of different places, and there was a lot of talk about coming back to the country and starting an organization which would be international in nature. And we came back, and I waited a year and a half, and nobody had done anything. So that's when I started building what's now known as Community Colleges for International Development. It's an international organization throughout the world, and brings people together to the U.S. For years it was located here in Brevard County. Then we moved it to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And after many years up there, it's just moving back to Miami-Dade State College. And the idea is to bring people from all over the world in to experience our educational system, and our people traveling around the world to see what educational systems are like around the world. And it's a great organization, and I take pride in going to their meeting once a year and presenting an award in honor of a German that helped us with that organization. His name was Werner Kupsch. We had him in Brevard many times. I gave him an honorary doctor's degree, and when he passed away, I started this award called the Werner Kupsch Award. It's given every year to the citizen in this country that's doing the most to have an international understanding through their community.
If you had to give some advice today to a young up-and-coming educator who is starting out in their career, you know, and everything you've learned over your career, you know, what advice would you give them in order to grow their career the best way?
Get out in the community, get in your area, get in your workplace, and listen to, and you'll hear some good things being said that somebody needs to take up on and do something with. And keep your ears open, and keep talking about what you hear. And I take great pride in Bernie Simpkins, for example. He was on one of our trustees, and Bernie has done very well with his entrepreneurial program, telling people about how to be successful in the work world. And I think that happening all over the country is important to our country, and it's important to the rest of the world as well.
Today, you're how old are you now, Max?
87, excuse me. 87, just turned 87.
And what do you see as the main important things for Brevard County leaders going forward? What sort of things should they be focusing on and really moving towards?
Well, I think focus on the past as well as the present and look to the future. There's a lot of things that's happened in the community that needs to be remembered. There are a lot of people that have gone before us that did great things for our community, state, and nation that need to be remembered. And don't just think about the future or even the present. Think about the past. And the legacy that you leave should live on and to influence other people in their lives and in their goals as they move forward and what needs to be done to improve the community, nation, and world. And believe me, a lot needs to be done to improve the world today with all the problems we're having in the Middle East and so forth. And we just need to, I think I'll tell you one story that I don't think is out of place at all. My mother, I told you about, she had done a great job with her 8 children. But we would always, on Saturday, go downtown 2nd Street in Fort Pierce and do a little shopping. And there was a Reuben family ran the department store, and I knew the family real well. And I remember going there one day with my mother, and she ended up buying some little thing. And as we were leaving, Mr. Reuben had waited on her. And as we were leaving, Mother said, "You know, Maxwell, that Mr. Reuben sure is a fine Christian gentleman." I said, "Mama, Mr. Reuben is Jewish." She said, "I don't care, he's still a fine Christian gentleman." And that always made an impression. No matter what religion you are, you can be a good person, whether you're like Islamic or Hindu. And later on in my travel throughout India, I was able to work with some people from Kashmir. And this one lady told me almost the same story my mother had. She was neighbors. She happened to be Hindu, but she lived next to Muslims, and they were good friends. But then the religion started fracturing, and she was sort of forbidden to speak with her neighbor. And she didn't like that. She said, "We're all one people, and we need to improve our relationships around the world." And that story that my mother told, I tell that, and it was true. And I think that maybe I helped the lady in Kashmir by repeating the same story to her, but I don't know. I'll never know for sure.